He was the most recognized face in professional wrestling, possibly the most recognized face in American entertainment for an entire decade. The blonde mustache, the red and yellow, the 24-inch pythons, the voice that could fill an arena of 80,000 people and make every one of them feel like they were being spoken to personally. For an entire generation, Hulk Hogan wasn't just a wrestler. He was a symbol, a specific, loudly American idea of strength and heroism and invincibility, the kind that doesn't apologize and doesn't bend and always finds a way to win. And then investigators walked into a room he had kept hidden. Not a metaphorical room, a physical space, locked, private, deliberately concealed from every part of his life that existed in public view. A room whose contents, according to reports, raised questions that the people who had grown up believing in Terry Bollea as a cultural institution were genuinely unprepared to sit with, questions that didn't fit neatly into any of the stories that had already been told about him. What was found, or what is reported to have been found, didn't match the image. Not the arena image, not the television image, not even the carefully reconstructed post-scandal image that his team had spent years managing. After the most damaging chapter of his very public life, it pointed toward something that existed behind all of those versions of him, something that had been there for a long time, something that, once it became visible, could not be made invisible again. The people who knew him well, who had traveled alongside him, built careers inside the machinery of his fame, been present in the parts of his life the cameras never reached, found themselves being asked questions they hadn't anticipated. Careful questions, the kind that come from people who are not yet ready to reach a conclusion, but are very determined to understand a sequence of events. Some of those people answered, some did not. What follows is the story of what was uncovered, what it means, and why the full weight of it may not be completely visible yet. To understand what investigators reportedly found, you first have to understand what Hulk Hogan had spent his entire adult life building, and how completely that construction had come to define not just his public identity, but, by most accounts, the way he understood himself in private as well. Terry Gene Bollea was born in Augusta, Georgia, in 1953. He grew up in Tampa, Florida, a city that would remain central to his story across the following 7 decades, where he played bass, guitar in bands and moved through a young adulthood that gave little outward indication of what was coming. He found his way into professional wrestling through a combination of physical presence, natural charisma, and the kind of focused, single-minded ambition that tends to belong to people who identify very early in life the thing they believe they were made to do. He was trained partly by the legendary Hiro Matsuda, who reportedly broke Bollea's leg during their very first training session, a story Hogan has returned to in interviews many times over the years, presenting it as evidence of both how serious the business was and how committed he was to entering it regardless of the cost. Whether the precise details of that story have stayed entirely consistent across its many tellings is a separate question. The quality it was meant to demonstrate, a willingness to absorb punishment in pursuit of something larger, was real, and it would define how he carried himself for the rest of his career. He became Hulk Hogan in the late 1970s, slowly at first, finding the shape of the character in territory circuits and early WWF appearances in front of crowds that were still figuring out what they were looking at. And then, in January of 1984, in Madison Square Garden, he defeated the Iron Sheik for the WWF Championship, and something locked into place that would not come undone for the better part of a decade. Hulkamania was the phrase his promoters gave to what followed, and for once the marketing language was simply accurate. He headlined WrestleMania repeatedly. He crossed over into film and television with an ease that almost no one in his position had managed before him. He appeared on cereal boxes and Saturday morning cartoons, his face and his catchphrases absorbed by children who had never watched a wrestling match in their lives. He became, in a very literal and deliberate sense, a product, a piece of cultural infrastructure that millions of people had invested in emotionally, often without fully understanding that was what they were doing. That investment is important. It is what gives the later chapters of this story their particular weight. It explains why each revelation has landed differently than a typical celebrity scandal, why it feels, for a certain generation, less like disappointment and more like something closer to disorientation, because Hulk Hogan had already been through one catastrophic public reckoning before the more recent one came into view. The 2012 sex tape involving his former close friend Bubba the Love Sponge's wife, and the subsequent Gawker lawsuit that eventually produced a $140 million verdict before being settled, had already stripped away considerable portions of the public persona. What emerged from those recordings was not the man the arenas had spent years cheering. The language on those tapes, including racially offensive statements that were neither ambiguous nor defensible, resulted in WWE severing ties with him entirely. His merchandise disappeared. His name was removed from their Hall of Fame, at least temporarily. For a period, it seemed reasonable to believe that the Hulk Hogan story had simply reached its end. But it hadn't. He worked his way back with visible effort. He made apologies in public forums. He went on television. He did the slow, effortful, sometimes uncomfortable public labor of trying to repair something that a significant number of people believed could not be repaired. And gradually, cautiously, with conditions, the industry began to allow him back in. He was reinstated to the WWE Hall of Fame in 2018. He appeared at WrestleMania events. The machinery of rehabilitation was in motion, and it was producing results. And then the questions about a hidden room began to surface. For the people who worked inside the wrestling industry during the years of Hulk Hogan's dominance, daily life existed in two clearly distinct registers. There was the public register, the matches, the promos, the handshakes with children at appearances, the photo shoots, the carefully managed press availability. And there was the private register, the locker rooms, the long drives between cities, the hotel corridors where the real business of being a traveling entertainer played out without cameras present and without the performance that cameras required. Hogan was known, by most accounts, to maintain a clear and deliberate boundary between those two registers. He understood his public persona as a product, something to be protected, delivered consistently, and never contaminated by whatever existed on the other side of it. That discipline is not unusual in entertainment at his level. It is, in many ways, simply what the job requires at a certain scale of fame. The question that investigators would eventually begin asking was not whether that separation existed. It was what the separation had been used to contain. His properties over the years were notable for their size and their sense of theater. Homes in Clearwater and Bel Air, Florida, in the waterfront money of Tampa Bay, that reflected the aesthetic of a man who had built his entire identity around the concept of largeness. Large body, large voice, large arena entrances that began in darkness and ended in noise. It followed, perhaps naturally, that the physical spaces he inhabited were designed to make an impression, visible, intentional, the kind of homes that communicated something specific about who lived inside them. But large homes contain rooms, and rooms can serve purposes that their original architecture never intended. According to reports, investigators who were examining certain aspects of Hogan's life in connection with a broader inquiry became aware of a space within one of his properties that did not appear in the standard layout of the home, a space that had been, according to accounts from people familiar with the situation, specifically constructed to be inaccessible to anyone without prior knowledge of its existence. Not a room you would stumble across, a room you would have to know about. The details of what brought investigators to the property in the first place, what specific thread of inquiry led them there, and under what legal authority they entered, have not been fully made public as of the time this story was examined. What has been reported is that when the room was accessed, what it contained generated a level of investigative interest that was significant enough and sustained enough to change the direction of the broader inquiry. No charges had been filed at the time of this reporting. No official conclusion has been reached, but the discovery itself, according to multiple sources with knowledge of the matter, marked the point at which investigators began asking different questions than the ones they had arrived with. When a law enforcement agency becomes interested in a private space, the language they use in their official documentation tends to be clinical, precise, stripped of the kind of framing that would be appropriate in a story, but is inappropriate in a legal record. Investigators describe what they find in terms that serve a legal purpose, not an emotional one. What makes the reports surrounding Hogan's hidden room notable is the degree to which even that stripped-down, clinical language carries a. According to reports from sources familiar with the investigation, several individuals who had been part of Hogan's extended professional circle were interviewed by investigators during the period following the discovery of the hidden room. Their accounts, which have not been publicly disclosed in detail, and which are reported here in the careful language appropriate to information that has not been formally verified or tested in any legal proceeding, reportedly addressed questions about the room, about what it contained, and about aspects of Hogan's behavior across different periods of his life that investigators considered potentially relevant to what they were trying to understand. What those accounts added, according to sources, was a layer of context that no physical evidence alone could provide. The discovery of the room had established that something was being actively concealed. The testimony of people who had existed in Hogan's life over time began to address the question of why and for how long, and whether the concealment was a matter of ingrained habit or a matter of genuine necessity. One element that reportedly emerged from these conversations was a picture of someone who maintained an unusually tight and deliberate control over which people had access to which parts of his life, not simply the standard public versus private distinction that anyone operating at his level of visibility would naturally maintain, but something more granular than that, a more carefully constructed series of layers, each one kept separate from the others with evident intention. People who knew him in one context, according to these accounts, did not necessarily know anything about him in another. Circles that coexisted but were never permitted to intersect. Compartments that were maintained not casually but with care. That kind of compartmentalization is not, in isolation, evidence of wrongdoing. People structure their private lives in complex ways for many legitimate reasons, and the construction of boundaries between different parts of one's existence is not inherently suspicious. But when investigators are working to understand the context of a specific discovery, the pattern itself, the degree of deliberateness it reflects, the consistency with which it was maintained, becomes relevant to the question of whether what they found represents an isolated anomaly or part of something more sustained and more intentional. No official conclusion has been reached about what the testimony added to the investigation's overall picture. The matter remains under examination. There is a particular kind of psychological complexity that attaches to the unraveling of someone who was not simply famous, but symbolically important. Hulk Hogan was never merely a celebrity. He was a container for something, a vessel for a very specific cultural idea about what strength looked like, what heroism meant, what resilience was supposed to feel like from the inside. He arrived in American entertainment at a moment when that idea had enormous appetite, and an entire commercial machinery built to amplify it. The people who cheered for him in those arenas were not simply responding to an effective performer. They were responding to something that had been constructed with real craft to speak directly to a need they were carrying. That is what makes the accumulation of revelations around Terry Bollea so genuinely difficult to sit with. Each layer, the tape, the language, the lawsuit, and now the hidden room, doesn't simply damage the image. It reaches backward and raises a more uncomfortable question: whether the image was ever an accurate representation of the person it claimed to show. Whether the man delivering the promos about training and prayers and vitamins was the same man who existed in the locked room, in the dark, with the cameras off, the people who knew him across different periods, the wrestlers who had traveled long roads alongside him, the industry figures who had worked inside the machinery of his promotion, the people who had been genuinely close to him at various points in his life, have offered, taken together, a picture that resists the simplicity of either the icon or the villain. They describe someone who could be genuinely warm, genuinely generous in the specific, personal moments that don't have an audience, genuinely present in ways that felt real and unperformed. They also describe someone who had, from very early in his career, understood himself primarily as a character designed to be projected outward and who had perhaps, after decades of living inside that projection, arrived at a place where the boundary between the performance and the actual person had become genuinely difficult to locate. Even for him, that psychological dimension is worth spending time with, because it is not particular to Hulk Hogan. The question of what becomes of a person who builds their entire public identity around a sustained performance of strength, and who then spends decades defending that performance against any evidence that complicates or contradicts it, is not an unusual human question. The specific circumstances are extraordinary. The underlying dynamic is something many people would recognize from much closer to home. As of the time this story was examined, the investigation remained ongoing. No charges had been publicly filed in connection with the hidden room. No official conclusion had been reached. The full account of what the room contained, what it meant in the context of the broader inquiry, and what the investigation had determined about its relationship to the other questions it had opened, none of that had been made public. The family had not made detailed statements. The legal team had maintained its careful posture of addressing nothing specific. The silence was not empty, but it was, for now, intact. What remained, in the absence of resolution, were questions about who Terry Bollea actually was in the private spaces behind the construction, about what the room held and why it had been built, about the distance between the image the world had been given and the interior it had been kept from, and whether that distance had always been as vast as it now appeared to be. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with the unraveling of someone who meant something to you, and it is different from the grief of loss. It is the grief of retrospective doubt, of going back through the memories, the Saturday morning cartoons, the WrestleMania moments, the specific feeling of being a child and believing, completely and without reservation, that the person on the screen represented something worth believing in, and finding that those memories now have a question attached to them that wasn't there before. That kind of grief is not dramatic. It settles slowly. It doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly at the edge of things and doesn't go away just because you stop looking at it directly. The story of what investigators found in Hulk Hogan's hidden room is not finished. It is active, ongoing, still being examined by people whose professional purpose is to reach the kinds of conclusions that the rest of us are not yet in a position to see. The full picture may be years from public disclosure. Parts of it may never be disclosed at all. That uncertainty is uncomfortable, and it is genuine. And it is the honest condition of engaging with a story that has not yet ended. What can be said now is that the investigation represents a reckoning of a different kind than the previous ones. The 2015 tape scandal was damaging in ways that were visible and direct, a revelation about character, about who a person was in an unguarded and recorded moment. What investigators are reportedly now examining is different in its nature. It concerns choices made deliberately over an extended period of time, in a space that was specifically designed to be invisible to anyone who wasn't supposed to see it. That specificity carries weight. A room doesn't become hidden without intention. The particular effort required to make a physical space inaccessible to casual discovery, to construct concealment, rather than simply close a door, implies both an awareness of what is being hidden and a sustained decision to keep it hidden. What that implies about the person who built the room, and about what they understood themselves to be protecting, is something the investigation is still working to formally address. Until it does, the rest of us remain in the uncomfortable position of holding questions that the available facts cannot yet answer for the industry that was built, in part, around the legacy of what Hulk Hogan represented: the promoters, the broadcasters, the wrestlers who came up inside the tradition he helped define, and the audiences who gave that tradition its meaning and its energy. The situation presents a challenge without a clean resolution. You cannot unsee what has been revealed. You cannot go back to the innocence of the arenas once you understand something about what was existing alongside them. But you also cannot simply erase a history that genuinely shaped a cultural form across multiple decades, however complicated that history has now become. What you can do is look clearly at the image and at what existed behind it, at the performance and at the person, at the gap between them and at what that gap apparently contained. Not with anger, not with the particular satisfaction of being proven right about something you had suspected, simply with the willingness to see what is actually there, honestly and without the filter of what you were given to believe in when you were younger. That is, in the end, the most honest thing any story like this one can ask of the people who follow it. Not a verdict, not a resolution that the facts don't yet support, just clarity, just the willingness to look, if this story stayed with you, if it made